Good morning, welcome to the Arab Center, Washington, D.C.'s 6th annual conference, and welcome to this very particular panel titled U.S. Policy on Palestine. My name is Marwan Bishara. I'm pleased to be here today with an exceptional lineup of academics who will assess U.S. policy towards Palestine and Israel with a special focus on the Biden administration's approach to Palestinian rights and statehood. To prepare for today's discussion, I sort of dusted off a paper I wrote a few years ago for the Arab Center on a century of US policy towards Palestine from Wilson to Obama, where I basically concluded that, in fact, there was never a US Palestine policy, let alone a Palestine prism with which the US saw the Arab-Israeli conflict. So to summarize a century of US policy on Palestine or towards Palestine, I'll take a minute or two. I'll say the following, that historically the US policy towards Palestine was always a byproduct of three other policies or prisms. One, a great power, imperial, Cold War, post-Cold War, war on terror prism. Two, regional, Arab, Muslim prism. And three, there's the Zionist, later Israeli lobby prism. So to decipher the US policy on Palestine in each and every historical phase, one needs to, in fact, have a sort of a 3D analytical spectacle, where the imperial, the regional, and the Israeli lenses are laid out on top of each other. If you saw the Hollywood epic, The National Treasure, you remember how Nicolas Cage deciphered the secret map on the back of the US constitutions to find the hidden treasure? Well, it's something like that. At each and every phase, one needs to lay out these three different prisms in order to be able to decipher the US policy on Palestine. Now, that might be a difficult task. What is not difficult to decipher is the US failure in Palestine. One does not need a 3D spec for that. It's been big, it's been huge, it's been mega failure. And that's why it is high time for the US administration to listen to a Palestinian perspective or the Palestinian perspectives and even embrace them for ending the conflict and producing a just and a peaceful resolution. That's why this, in fact, brings me to the importance of this very particular panel. Because I think it's been 20 years since I've been joined by such four speakers, for specialists, for academics, because they are not just any four American academics, they are for Palestinian American academics, and who is best situated to analyze and recommend policy changes than the Palestinians whose voice have basically been hidden. I will take a few seconds to pay tribute to the last time I spoke in Washington when four other Palestinian speakers were present: Nasir Arouri, Sabih Farsoon, Hisham Sharabi, and Mohammed Hallaj. None of them are with us today, but for every Hallaj and for every Arouri, we have dozens and dozens of Palestinian voices, academics, specialists in think tanks, in universities across the United States. And so it's a pleasure to welcome four of such distinguished specialists with us today. I'm going to introduce them in their speaking order, starting with Sherene Seikaly. Sherene is an associate professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a historian of capitalism, consumption, and development in the modern Middle East. She's widely published, with her most recent book project titled From Baltimore to Beirut on the question of Palestine. And second, we have Tareq Baconi, is the International Crisis Group Senior Analyst for Israel-Palestine and Economics of Conflict. His research focuses on the contemporary geopolitics of the Middle East with an emphasis on Israel-Palestine. Third speaker is Dana Kurd. Dana is an assistant professor at the University of Richmond and specializes in comparative Politics and international relations. Her area of interest include state-society relations, authoritarianism, and international intervention in the region. Last but not least, we have Yusuf Manayer, a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and a member of the editorial committee of the Journal of Palestine Studies. I personally remember him as the director of the Jerusalem Fund once upon a time, when he led its Palestine Center, its educational arm. Before I give the floor to Sherene, I just would like to remind our audience to send your questions using the Q&A feature in bottom there in the Zoom, or by email to events@arabcenterdc.org. Sherene, the floor is yours. You have 10, maybe 12 minutes.
Thank you very much. I will do my best to stay on time. On September 6, sometime between 1:20 and 1:40 a.m., 6 men made their way through a narrow tunnel, unearthing an empty space under a metal grid in cell room 5, wing number 2. The men had dug an escape route from a prison Israel built in 2004 to add to the number of already existing prisons to further escalate its incarceration of Palestinians in the wake of the Second Intifada. For months they dug, more than 9 months of careful, grinding work of engineering freedom. And in a matter of minutes, they had transcended that line between life and death that runs through a prison cell. In a matter of minutes, they arrived on the other side of those prison walls, about 60 days after another one of Israel's comprehensive assaults on the Gaza Strip, the one they labeled Operation Guardian of Walls. And for 5 days, these 6 men and their great escape united the imaginations of Palestinians across those territorial divisions carved from death and dispossession. A small hole in the earth took shape as an imaginative escape route. What can this opening teach us about the path forward, about possibility in the realms of high diplomacy and formal politics, about the future in a time that has been arguably the worst in Palestinian history? We are, after all, still licking our wounds from the Trump administration's bulldozing of basic standards of international law. We are still coming to terms with the spectacle of Arab regimes tripping over themselves to harness the military and financial profits of Kushner's deal of the century. From Morocco to the Arabian Peninsula, these regimes have attempted to normalize Israel's settler colonial enterprise, their own state authoritarianism, and the role of the United States as the faithful caretaker of both intertwined structures. Yet these phenomena are anything but normal, however ensconced they are in our everyday. Indeed, these last months have treated us to the spectacle of the Palestinian Authority's aspirational authoritarianism, drawing on the police state playbook of counter-revolutionary Arab regimes. The PA unleashed plainclothes thugs, brutally assaulted civilian demonstrators, targeted journalists covering the protests and confiscated their equipment, threatened the relatives of dissidents, and singled out women protesters with slander and violence. Since 8 August 21, a sweeping campaign of arrests has focused on activists, academics, poets, intellectuals, and others critical of the ossified and corrupt PA leadership. In fact, this is another layer of the ongoing campaign of Israeli forces and how they target and arrest dissidents. In the midst of these cycles of despair and dispossession, 6 men dug a small opening in the earth and carved for the rest of us a portal of joy, of time, and of possibility. This portal took us to the immediate past of the Unity Uprising, when for the first time in 85 years, a nationwide strike united all the lands and peoples of Palestine, each in pitched battles to remain on that land, in Jerusalem, but also inside the Green Line, in Lid, in the Naqab, in Haifa, in al-Fahim. The opening also took us to 2 July 2014, when Israeli police found the tortured and burnt 16-year-old body of Mohammed Abu Khdeir in a Jerusalem forest. 6 young Israeli settlers had kidnapped him on his way to prayer, forced him to drink gasoline, and lit him on fire. Those 1.5 million people subjected to the injurious and colonial label Israeli Arab, quote unquote, took to the streets from the south in the Naqab to the north in Haifa. Throughout the non-contiguous Bantustans of the West Bank, Palestinians rose up. On both sides of the Green Line that partitions historic Palestine, there were pitched battles with Israeli forces. One side threw rocks, the other side threw tear gas, rubber-coated bullets, live fire, and toxic water called skunk. That small opening in the earth took us to a more distant past, to the revolutionaries of the First Intifada, who faced brutality with civil disobedience, to the stone throwers whose time in Israeli prisons became rites of passage, to the strikers and marchers who stood up against land confiscation inside Israel on Land Day in 1976, to the Fidaiyin of the Palestinian Revolution in the 1960s and 70s, to the rebels of 1936 to 1939, who for a brief moment liberated the cities of Palestine from British rule, to the popular refusal centered on Jerusalem in 1929. We know that grassroots mobilizations are multifarious and in constant tension with national and international politics. We know that the Unity Uprising, just these last months, seized a moment of opportunity opened by the defeat of the Trump administration's imperative to destroy Palestine and the Palestinians. But these mass mobilizations, these experiments with freedom, are not an afterthought. They are not secondary to the vaunted halls of high politics. If history can teach us anything, it is the centrality of 2 inextricable forces. 1, popular political will that has repetitively and historically dragged leaders, often kicking and screaming, to the front lines of popular uprising. And 2, the centrality of peoplehood. Indeed, the portal of the Great Escape can transport us to well over a century ago, to the denial of Palestinian peoplehood that began with the Balfour Declaration of November 1917. This short memorandum rendered Jewish an ethno-national category in Palestine. It defined the land and its inhabitants by this category, despite the fact that Jews constituted 5% of the people who lived in Palestine at the turn of the 20th century. The Balfour Declaration decreed the majority of the Palestinians who lived on the land nameless. It defined them by what they were not, non-Jewish. It would become the juridical infrastructure of British rule until 1948. Since then, we can trace the relentless attempt to deny Palestinian peoplehood at all costs, even among those UN resolutions we have come to depend on as grounds for basic inalienable rights, 181, 242, and so on. Indeed, Oslo itself was a clear attempt to formalize the colonial separations partitioning the Palestinian people. And this latest Unity Uprising was the final death knell, not simply for the stillborn deal of the century, but more importantly, for the logic that confines Palestinian peoplehood to a sliver of the land and the people. Those 6 Palestinians who had dug their way to freedom, albeit temporary, costly, and elusive, teach us about transgressing borders we have come to imagine as impenetrable. Their condition of fugitivity reminds us of the many borders we have yet to overcome. As a historian, Tina Kempt has pointed out, fugitivity describes those who cannot or do not remain in the places to which they have been confined. Perhaps those 6 Palestinians did not simply define the prison walls. Perhaps too, along with now a near century of Palestinian rebels, they defy our very concept of freedom as tied only and inextricably to the borders of the nation state. Palestinian peoplehood is attuned to a slower pace of change, a temporality of endurance, those unseen granule struggles, those forgotten mobilizations, that everyday power of restlessness that is beyond, before, and through state boundaries. They have taught us yet again that we must exit our insistence on recognition and return once again to the imperative, the process, and the future of freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherene, for such a thoughtful reflection. Clearly, some of the metaphors used and some of the phrases do underline the Palestinian response to America's and Israel's policies throughout that of openings and more openings and resistance and so on and so forth. That reflection hopefully will take us to Tareq. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marwan, and thank you for having me here. And yes, indeed, Sherene's intervention, very eloquent intervention, does lead into my own intervention, which focuses specifically on the Gaza Strip. The events that Sherene talked about in May, in June, the Unity Intifada that erupted across Palestine is exactly the prism through which we need to look at the Gaza Strip. Often, particularly in Israeli and American discourse, the Gaza Strip is exceptionalized. It's put aside as a separate reality or a separate case study that needs to be identified and engaged with, separate from the rest of the question of Palestine. But the events of May demonstrated more effectively than ever before that actually realities in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, and even in Israel itself, as well as in the diaspora, are all interlinked. In the past, the military assaults that Israel wages on the Gaza Strip, which there have been many, would have in some ways been seen and portrayed as a form of self-defense against Hamas's rockets. Hamas's armed resistance itself is oftentimes the result of the movement seeking to unsettle the status quo and to push back against a blockade that enforces a form of collective punishment over more than 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Through armed resistance, Hamas has historically, at least obviously since 2007, when the blockade in its current format was institutionalized, Hamas had used armed resistance to push back and to challenge the blockade and to force Israel into concessions, to allow the access of more humanitarian goods or more eased restrictions for movement of people in and out of the Gaza Strip. In May, the sequence of events differed from that. Hamas's armed resistance and rocket fire was not specifically in response to the blockade, but rather in response to Israeli aggression and attacks against Palestinians in Jerusalem. And in that way, Hamas broke out of what had been a period of containment and a period of separation of Hamas and the Gaza Strip from the rest of Palestine, showing very vocally, explicitly, militarily its connection with and response to the Palestinian struggle in its entirety. Now, it's important in this session to focus specifically on the US policies toward that particular military assault and what that means for the Gaza Strip going forward. There are several things that we need to note in terms of how the Biden administration responded to that. The first is that the Biden administration had no contact at all with the government, Hamas's government in the Gaza Strip, obviously as a form of non-engagement with Hamas. The Biden administration could only go through the Palestinian Authority, which had no control over the reality of what was happening in the Gaza Strip. The Biden administration also blocked several attempts at the at the UN Security Council to push forward resolutions to ask for a ceasefire, including resolutions that were tabled by China and by France. So just thinking about the speaker just before this panel, the fact that China was pushing in this instance to achieve a ceasefire quicker than the US, while the US was, again, as the speaker noted, committed to Israel's security and to the right of Israel to, quote unquote, defend itself, shows the US to actually be consistent in policies that are decades old in terms of maintaining Israeli supremacy in Israel-Palestine. And at the same time, the Biden administration noted that there was no disproportionality in Israeli attacks in the Gaza Strip, despite the fact that we had a level of destruction happen in the Gaza Strip that was described by Palestinians in Gaza themselves as being in some cases worse than what had happened in 2014, with the leveling of whole blocks of buildings and blocks of residential apartments that were housing foreign journalists reporting on what was happening in the Gaza Strip. The ceasefire only came into place after Israel had deemed that it had fulfilled its military goals in the Gaza Strip, and that was the moment at which the American administration packaged a sort of a ceasefire and presented it as something that they had worked behind the scenes to reach. In reaching a ceasefire, there was actually there were a number of similarities in what the Biden administration did this time round with past military assaults, which was predominantly to rely on Egypt and to rely on Israel as the two parties that could decide when and how Hamas could be pressured into a ceasefire agreement. Now, it's really important for us to also think about what happens post-ceasefire when the international media starts looking away. We're talking about almost 3 months after the ceasefire. Humanitarian aid was only allowed into the Gaza Strip about 2 weeks ago on August 30. The process of getting the humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip had initially, well, not initially, for the past few years, had been covered through Qatar, which dispersed funds into the Gaza Strip, essentially subsidizing, in some ways, Israel's blockade, allowing the blockade to continue while paying for the hardships of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, very much a band-aid on an open wound. After this current ceasefire, Israel prevented even that disbursement of funds. A new mechanism had to be negotiated with the UN using the World Food Program to disperse money through American banks into the Gaza Strip, which provides Israel with more control over this disbursement of funds. The second thing that happened is that it was only up until August that Israel has gone back to issuing permits for Palestinians in Gaza to leave the Gaza Strip and enter Israel as labor. The permits only came into place with their pre-COVID levels of about 2,000 permits. So we're talking about 2 million Palestinians collectively imprisoned in Gaza. 2,000 permits are currently allowed by Israel. And the third point about the ceasefire taking effect is that the funds for reconstruction continue to be prohibited from entry, and Israel is very much tying these reconstruction tools to the release of the bodies of Israeli soldiers and 2 Israeli civilians that Hamas is allegedly holding onto. So very much another example of collective punishment, in the sense that reconstruction and humanitarian aid is being politicized and made specific on the attempts to pacify Hamas and to get political concessions from Hamas. I want to say 2 more points about Gaza specifically and how it fits into the Israeli and American policies towards the question of Palestine. In the past, the situation in the Gaza Strip, as far as the Israeli establishment viewed it, was to deal, and as far as there was a strategy, and in many cases there wasn't a strategy beyond mowing the lawn, so the occasional carrying out of military assaults against the Gaza Strip to deter Hamas from military action. The negotiating strategy that Israel held on to was one referred to as calm for calm, essentially that they would allow calm in the Gaza Strip. They will not carry out military assaults in the Gaza Strip as long as Hamas does not fire rockets into Israel. This calm for calm formula was based on the blockade remaining in place. So it essentially removes the sense that the blockade itself is a structure of violence that is creating death and impoverishment in the Gaza Strip. So the expectation was that Hamas would not carry out any form of armed resistance and acquiesce to the presence of the blockade. Now, obviously, that formula had failed and had resulted in several iterations whereby Israel would have to carry out massive military assaults against the Gaza Strip, of the latest being in May. In the current constellation of factors on the ground, the new Israeli government has come out with a slight reformulation of this strategy of calm for calm, what Foreign Minister Lapid has called economics for security. So this strategy is essentially based on the idea that the Palestinians in Gaza Strip would only get economic relief if Hamas acquiesces to a long-term truce, and if there are measures put in place for Hamas to cease all forms of military action. And this actually ties very much with what the speaker before this panel was talking about, which is to look forward, to look at economics, and to look at security. This is very much still viewing the Gaza Strip within the prism of security in ways that makes any form of humanitarianism or economic growth dependent on political concessions by Palestinians. So in order for Palestinians to be able to have livelihoods, to be able to have their rights fulfilled, they have to acquiesce to a political agenda that is being dictated by Israel, and obviously backed by the US and regionally backed by the powers that are very much part of the new Middle East, as noted by the normalization agreements that were celebrated also in the session before this one. And so in the effort in the new Biden, or new quote unquote Biden administration's efforts towards the Gaza Strip, it's actually a continuation of past efforts, including the Trump administration's efforts of making sure that there are economic measures put in place to enhance the lives of Palestinians while maintaining the structures of domination and the structures of oppression in place. It is within those structures that then the lives of Palestinians through a humanitarian or economic lens are being addressed. Until there is a political intervention in place that allows for the Gaza Strip and broadly for Palestine to be seen through a political lens, we're likely to continue seeing the same kinds of escalations and military assaults on the Gaza Strip that we had over the past 15 years. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tareq. I guess we've just gone from the metaphorical to the microcosmic, with Gaza being the focal point of resistance, in fact, being the microcosm of the complexity and tragedy that is called Palestine. And one must say or underline Israel's and America's failure in dealing with the tragedy of Gaza. And when it comes to the economics of peace, I'm just always mesmerized by the capacity of politicians in various American administrations to repeat the same mistakes. Because back in the 1990s, in the mid-1990s, from the summit of Casablanca to the summit of Amman, for 5 years, they only spoke about the economics of peace. And we all understood that without political solution, there is no economic development in Palestine. And that's what happened. It just basically all blew up in their faces. Trying again to attempt, as Tareq was saying, an economics of peace in order to forego any political or just solution to Palestinian questions, in my opinion, will prove to be a mistake. Again, which will take me, will take us from the metaphorical to the microcosmic, and with Dana to...
Yes, hi, thank you so much. So today I'm going to try to build on some of what the previous panels have spoken about, but kind of widen the scope a little bit to discuss more the American impact on policy, activism, and the Palestinian cause from 2007 until today, and touching on the recent events at the end of my comments. So, you know, my role here is not to necessarily make large claims about where we should go, though of course I have personal opinions on the matter, but to explain the impacts of American involvement on a number of levels, and to kind of pinpoint or diagnose the challenges and obstacles that Palestinians face in spite of the proven consistent resistance and ingenuity that they demonstrate. I'll be talking, as I said, I'll give a background on forms of American influence after the Oslo Accords, but particularly after 2007, kind of the consolidation of the Palestinian Authority. And I'll discuss impacts of aid and impacts of American involvement in the security forces and like the repressive arms, and also the American impact on social ties and what that means for Palestinian mobilization capacity and public opinion moving forward. So first of all, in terms of aid, so I don't touch on aid very deeply in my own work, but there is a lot of research and literature to suggest, including some recent great additions in Palestinian writing on this topic, including Manager's recent book Promoting Democracy, as well as Karim Rabia's recent book Palestine is Throwing a Party and Everyone is Invited. In terms of some of the findings of that literature, from the onset of the Oslo kind of framework, Manager's book provides a very in-depth look at how exclusionary those dynamics were from the beginning, and how, unlike other countries that were deemed post-conflict at that time period, the sorts of American aid that were used in the Palestinian territories were quite politicized. So she compares El Salvador and Palestine in particular, but the takeaway is that the aid that was given to the Palestinians during this time wasn't spent on, let's say capacity building, but it was more about political pacification, and it played a fragmenting role in Palestinian politics. And this was confirmed to me in my own work when I spoke to many Palestinian Authority officials working across a number of industries. They basically told me that, even though there are many aid benefactors, the American objectives are the standard, and they complained that from their perspective, it's used on kind of non-priorities, and that there was kind of day-to-day intervention from American counterparts in the use of aid and the use of funding, especially through training programs, where people would be excluded from certain trainings and things like this, depending on their political beliefs. They weren't kind of part of the American line. They also complained that it amounted to indoctrination in a lot of ways, because the contents of the training programs would be reviewed to make sure that there were no discussions of the Israeli occupation or popular mobilization. And so many people kind of confirmed that they're getting involved in the day-to-day decision making of particularly key ministries, in training, in kind of these kind of funding of programs, as well as influencing staffing and forcing kind of, let's say, more critical bureaucrats into early retirement. And then in terms of economic aid, here Karim's book was very illuminating as well. He looks at it through the lens of housing policy and planning, and how it led to basically a situation of dependency and indebtedness amongst the Palestinian middle class. And what emerged from kind of that policy framework, similar to kind of the economic security discussions that we've been having, is that not an economy that could circumvent the occupation, which is kind of what Prime Minister Salam Fayyad and all of those folks had envisioned, but one that facilitated the continued status quo and an economy in crisis. So we have a lot of indicators to show for that. We've got, the real GDP per capita in Palestine has been in decline. And just generally living standards have not improved. So that's kind of a snapshot of how Americans have used aid. But in terms of particularly their direct involvement in the security apparatus and in repression, they've, especially after 2007, they've been, and the kind of aborted elections of 2006, the US has been directly responsible for allocating aid to the PA on the basis of training the preventative security forces, for example, kind of the arm that is responsible for a lot of the political repression, and leading to a dramatic increase in policing and more coordination with Israel in terms of political repression, as well as purging certain members on charges of corruption or political unreliability. And again, this further divided the Palestinian Authority from its citizens. And we've seen repeated examples of the Palestinian Authority's coordination leading to the deaths of activists or assassinations of activists. And this time around with Nizar Banat, like we saw the very large scale repression that followed the protests. So in the interviews I conducted with security officials on these points, they were actually really illuminating, because they recognize that the US rhetoric is about democracy and accountability, but they know that the framework pushes them or allows them to go into a different direction. And a lot of the things they were telling me is like, you know, our society is not ready to be, we cannot be accountable to society because our society is not ready. A lot of people kept telling me that we have to be like Sweden or Scandinavia. I don't know why that's like the analogy that they always use. But essentially, you know, the PA and PA officials, particularly security officials, see themselves as the bulwark between the Palestinian society, which is not ready, and what is actually needed by Palestinian society, and anything that would lead them to become more accountable to their public is going to usher in their political opponents, which they likened to ISIS, and which they thought that every other political opponent has to be some sort of extremist wing. And so that's kind of on that front. And then finally, there's also how the US-backed PA has impacted kind of social ties and their ability and capacity to mobilize. So I've argued in previous work that these dynamics, a PA that's beholden to US decisions rather than accountable to their public, has led to a situation where Palestinian groups have been coordinating with each other much less, even when they have shared objectives, and groups have become more insular and have more grievances with each other. And such a dynamic has a negative impact on Palestinian capacity for mobilization. So I'm assuming everyone kind of listening is familiar with the ways in which the West Bank particularly has been split up after the Oslo Accords, with Area A, B, and C. And Area A is where the not vast majority, but the majority of Palestinians in the West Bank live, close to 60%. And historically also, because these are the urban centers, that's where we saw mobilization in the first Intifada, for example. Just understandably, there's a greater number of people and greater number of resources in these places. But what my findings showed is that from 2007, particularly until the present day, Area A only, despite accounting for about 60% of the population, accounts for only 22% of kind of any sort of protest activity, any kind of mobilization. So clearly, these multi-pronged policies of political pacification and demobilization as an objective of the Oslo's framework has been to some degree effective in creating indebted and repressed and fragmented Palestinians to some degree. And the latest wave of protests with the Unity Intifada, in my mind, taught us a lot about where the challenges remain as a part of this system, as well as where there are opportunities. So once again, what we saw with the Unity Intifada is that the margins, or the areas in which Israel has attempted to create margins, whether it's the Palestinian citizens of Israel or whether it's in Jerusalem, cutting them off from other segments of the Palestinian population, that's actually where the political opportunities were starkest, let's say. And similar to the data I just spoke about, it's clear that the West Bank this time around was also underrepresented in mobilization. So chronologically, protests began elsewhere. The PA actually stopped protests on a number of occasions when there was kind of like, reactions to what was happening in Jerusalem. But generally speaking, there was a sense that the West Bank was more reactive, and discussions I had and interviews I conducted with activists in the West Bank, I mean, they themselves will kind of describe their work as more outward facing, to the international community. And when they become involved in sort of nationwide campaigns, they say that they're taking the lead from elsewhere. So one activist said to me, we're engaged right now in tactics that are very needed, but we're not engaged in long-term strategy. So again, the areas that were intended to be more marginalized, that had been intended to be cut off from the broader Palestinian public, are the areas that are more active. And this is a problem, obviously, because there's a large number of Palestinians, almost 3 million in the West Bank, that we can say are not able to capitalize on their mobilizing capacity and the impact and force that their mobilization would entail. But there was a very clear articulation, I think this has been alluded to a number of times already, of a shared national struggle and activism, a lot of activism, not just the protests that we saw, but all these initiatives around raising a national consciousness. Those are exact terms that they were using, away from the Palestinian Authority and within the Green Line, the High Follow-Up Committee, and further divergence from the two-state norm or the two-state status quo, whatever that might entail. And we see that also in public opinion polling. A June poll by the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, my apologies, found that support for whatever a two-state solution might entail has dropped to 39%, and 61% of Palestinians find that this kind of solution is completely unviable, which is up even from 3 months prior to that in March from a different poll. So the American political establishment keeps talking about this solution and keeps talking about this as really kind of a continuation of the status quo, but this is far from the reality of what Palestinians are talking about or demanding. And I think that there will be consequences for the fact that most Palestinians don't buy it anymore. But at the same time, the one-state solution, when people in particularly in polling, they're asked about this, it's also not very popular. So the one-state solution dropped in support from 33 to 20% just in 3 months because of these events. And obviously, given that there's not really a space to articulate a new vision within the PA system, there is kind of no unified counter demand. So that kind of poses a problem as well. The last thing I'm going to say before I hand it off to Yousef is there is a lot of movement kind of on the American front both kind of at the policy level and at the level of like advocacy and activism, increased American support for Palestinians, whether it's legislative efforts such as the amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act or Betty McCollum's bill in the House about the defense of Palestinian children, as well as all of these like advocacy organizations and human rights organizations coming out with reports naming Israel as an apartheid system, and all of the activism that came about in the last few months as well, last few years, I would say. But I think there is also a bifurcation a little bit between what American allies are talking about and discussing and advocating for, and what Palestinians are having, kind of discussions amongst themselves. And that's kind of corroborated by some of this public opinion polling, particularly around the demand for binationalism, which to some Palestinians, not all, but a good amount, it contradicts in their minds the demand for decolonization. And so there's this kind of mismatch, let's say. Kind of the takeaway here is that even, if things let's say simmer down, activists are articulating things outside the bounds imposed upon them by the last 30 years, and especially since 2007. And I don't think that anybody can manage kind of this level of endemic instability. And American allies, particularly, which I assume make up a significant number of this audience, should probably think about how to reconcile some of the differences between what's happening in kind of this landscape and what's happening in Palestine. And so, the Unity Intifada, the protests might taper off, or there's no guarantees of success, but these waves of mobilization can be harnessed to exploit opportunities and learn from and address challenges, and so that this can become kind of an iterative process that each wave builds on the last. So I think, yeah, I'm just looking at my notes here. I think that's all I have. So I'll pass it over to Yousef.
Thank you, Dana. Yes, we are passing on to Yousef. I think we've heard from Dana about the mobilization, popular mobilization, and potential change of opinion among the Palestinians, confronting a stalemate and sort of dependency relations between the Palestinian Authority and the American administration, and the PA basically being held hostage to the Oslo process thus far. So that does require a change of mindset and a change of opinion. And I guess here, Yousef, you could help us a lot about that. Go ahead.
Thank you all. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you all, and I appreciate the opportunity to go at the end here. It gives me a chance to hear the brilliance of my co-panelists, and also, frankly, an opportunity for my blood pressure to settle after hearing the remarks from our speaker earlier today from the State Department. Needless to say, my perspective will diverge from his a little bit. I'm going to be speaking a little bit about sort of where I see Biden administration policy towards Israel-Palestine at this moment, and how we can evaluate it, and what potential opportunities for change there are. In general, I see this administration really symbolizing a sort of deprioritization of the issue, and frankly, an embrace almost of non-solutionism altogether, which I think does differ from previous administrations. In regards to deprioritization, I will say here I will differ significantly from Mr. Hood. U.S. interests in the Middle East do continue to evolve, and they do look different today, significantly and importantly so, than 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Of course, this doesn't mean that the United States does not have important interests in the region, but the nature of them has, I think, fundamentally changed. And I think it's important to look at a couple of key ways in which that is manifesting itself. First, the reality is whether the United States continues to import the same number of barrels a day as it did in 1987 today for the Middle East. It just does not rely on crude oil from the Middle East in the way that it has historically. That's just changed, and that is a very important change. The truth is far greater crude oil is produced here in the United States. American consumption has gone up. The proportion that comes from the region is much smaller today. Other partners, including the Canadians, make up a much larger proportion of American oil imports. So that's just changed. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that the United States doesn't have an interest in stable oil markets in the region, as it is tied into the global economy and so on. But it just does not look like the way that it did 30 or 40 years ago, and not even the way that it looked in the early 2000s either. That's important. The other thing that I would note that I think is really important in sort of shifting American posture in the region is this slow recovery, too slow of a recovery from the paradigm of the global war on terror, which I think we are finally starting to crawl out of. And I think we can look at the sort of recent American withdrawal from Afghanistan as an important sort of marker in that shift. And I want to be clear here that some of the most egregious policies of the global war on terror are going to continue, and there's no doubt that they are going to continue, as I think made clear by the most recent American drone strike in Afghanistan, which led to many civilian casualties, or entirely civilian casualties. But the sort of characteristic of major American troop presence in the Middle East that has been sort of the defining feature of the global war on terror, the so-called global war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan, that is changing. And I think American sort of public opinion in response to this has been pretty clear that the level of investment and presence in these countries has been a folly and has been a waste. I think that is also important and significant as well. The United States is simply not looking at the Middle East the way that it did 20 or 30 years ago. What does that mean for U.S. policy towards Israel and Palestine? I think the sort of shift away from the global war on terror framing, much like the shift away from the Cold War framing years before that, is an uncomfortable one for the state of Israel. These paradigms allowed the Israelis to sort of speak to Washington and to Americans more broadly in similar terms, to present themselves as like-minded countries who are on the same side of a global divide, who are partners in major security issues, indispensable partners in major security issues, and so on. The end of these paradigms, though, reveals far more gray areas in which those alliances, I think, in the value of them, can be more greatly questioned. And I think that is a moment that is starting to come upon us now. That being said, the Biden administration's agenda is packed with a significant range of other issues, both on the foreign and domestic front. And it's another one of those reasons why U.S. policy on Palestine and Israel has been deprioritized significantly. Just take, for example, the fact that the Obama administration, which of course this president served as vice president in, began on the very first day that it was sworn into office, or perhaps the second day, by naming a U.S. special envoy for the region. That, I think, spoke to at least the pretense of prioritizing this issue. And one can even look at the Trump administration in their own way. Trump, of course, even before coming into office, after he was elected, the very first appointment that he announced was the appointment of the U.S. ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, taking a very different approach on U.S. policy towards Israel, but nonetheless making it clear that Israel policy was going to be a top priority for the administration. We're seeing something very different here. This is an issue that the administration does not care to prioritize, is hoping it doesn't have to deal with, and it is approaching it in that way. And frankly, there are lots of other issues that it wants to prioritize, many of them for good reason, because there are significant crises that this government is dealing with, both in terms of the COVID pandemic, the economic recovery, and many other internal crises, as well as foreign challenges that they see as more important than the Israeli-Palestinian issue. What this has resulted in is the fact that even a pretense of seeking a solution is no longer necessary in the view of this administration. At least that's how I see it. I don't believe that previous administrations have actually sought a solution, but importantly, they have seen the importance of pretending to seek a solution. And they've seen the value of pretending to seek a solution for their own reasons. And it's no surprise that the United States has invested most heavily in the so-called peace process at the very moments that it was seeking to go to war in the Middle East, both in the early 1990s and then in the early 2000s. They understood the value of the Palestinian issue among Arab publics and the importance of balancing U.S. militarism in the region with the pretense of peacemaking. That's no longer the case. There's not even a pretense anymore of seeking a solution. Language around a two-state solution, and perhaps for the better, is now slowly disappearing. It is the ultimate fallback because of how ingrained it is in the policy discourse. But most of what we're hearing from administration officials now is not about seeking a two-state solution, but hoping to keep the conditions alive so that one day a two-state solution may be possible. This is a very different objective than the objective of a solution. This is the objective of management. And I think this has always been the policy of the United States government, to sort of manage the status quo and allow the Israelis to have their way with the Palestinians. But now it's become very transparent that that is the case. And part of this has become necessary because the parties, and in this case, I mean the Israeli government and the official sort of Palestinian leadership, are not interested in advancing a diplomatic process or challenging the status quo in any way. The Israelis are perfectly comfortable where they are. They are openly objecting to the idea of an independent Palestinian state now more than ever before. And the reality is that the official Palestinian leadership under the leadership of Mahmoud Abbas has never seemed more comfortable in being complacent with this reality. So when these are the sort of official partners that you have from the American perspective, there's very little interest that you have in taking the initiative to change that. So I think that's playing a significant role in what the US position is. And as I said, the result is an open policy of management. We saw this, I think, if one paid close attention to the recent meeting between President Biden and the new Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett. It seemed to be a sort of nondescript meeting where, if you read between the lines, a tacit agreement seemed to be in place that if you don't make my life difficult, we won't make your life difficult. Let's just try to keep things quiet and under control. And that seemed to be what came out of that meeting. You saw some American support for these so-called confidence-building measures, which is very much in line with the Naftali Bennett sort of agenda now of what they call narrowing the conflict through making minor changes to so-called quality of life issues. And it's essentially a rehashed version of Netanyahu's economic peace. It is another way of saying we're going to try to manage the situation. So what can change this or conversely prevent any change on this? I think there are a number of factors here that are worth discussing. First is the potential evolution of the US-Israel relationship. And I think given the potential for change now with this sort of shift away from a global war on terror paradigm, there are more opportunities to raise questions about the US-Israel alliance and particularly what that should look like and what the conditions of that alliance and relationship should be. But at the same time, there is a sort of competing dynamic between a urge to overcome this sort of partisan era of US-Israel relations and this sort of growing human rights pressure from some elements within US politics, particularly among liberals and the left. Among the sort of more establishment forces, there is this desire to go back to a bipartisan sort of, status quo ante, that Republicans and Democrats would have strong relations with Israel and continue to ignore human rights abuses. But there is a contingent, of course, I think, among Democrats which want to see a different relationship. That's something I think we need to continue to keep an eye on. I would also point to shifts in public opinion, which have been significant and seem to be continuing to grow in the direction of greater criticism of Israeli policy, particularly among Democrats and particularly among younger demographics, which will be in leadership positions in the future. I think it's also important to note that these polls continue to shift as there are major events on, within this issue playing out. And that brings us, I think, to the final thing that can really change the situation, and that is the situation on the ground. I think we've talked a little bit, and others have, about the challenges with Palestinian leadership, the role that they are playing in preventing real change, and really the obstacle that they are. But as Sherene made clear, with her very eloquent opening remarks in this session, all it took was a spoon to really shake the sort of invincible security state. And I think sometimes we do not realize how fragile that entire system really is. I think the events on the ground in May sent a message to Israelis and Palestinians and the whole world, actually, that Palestinians, despite the occupation, despite a system of apartheid, despite a sadly complicit leadership in these systems of control, actually retain a great degree of power to challenge the situation. And I think that the power that is in the hands of the Palestinian people, if if marshaled, if brought once again to the fore, can actually force many players, Palestinian leaders, Israelis, the United States, and the world in general, to move away from a policy of trying to manage the situation and once again have to address it head on. Thank you.
Thank you, Yousef. Unfortunately, because of all the changes that happened before this panel, we're going to need to rush things through. We will have a few minutes for some of the questions that I've been getting. I'm going to try to address each one of you for a quick answer, please. Starting with what Yousef just said about what Sherene said, which is about the popular mobilization and resistance, rebellion, and so on and so forth in Palestine. Sherene, how do you see Palestinian resistance evolving in the next phase?
I'm not good at making predictions. I'll leave that to my political science colleagues. But I did notice a question, if you might allow me, Marwan, about how do we think about the domestic challenges in the United States as linked to what's happening in the Middle East and North Africa. And I think these are your sort of query about, maybe I could take it as a what next for popular mobilization. And I think that, you know, coming out of or still in the midst of a global pandemic, as well as the ongoing attenuation of US hegemony, has really generalized a precarity globally. And I think the forces of climate change in particular has made sort of our confidence in progress and the future and time really has shaken so many of us. And I think that this is an incredible moment for possibility in terms of mobilizing inside the United States, in terms of what it means to live in this country and what kinds of material conditions are people struggling with, be it patriarchy or white supremacy or inequality more generally, and how it is linked to a broader imperial processes. So I think the Palestinians, and you know what I was trying to suggest with this kind of concept of fugitivity is that I think something that Palestinians often forget is, you know, we inspire other people, right? It's not just a kind of Palestinian condition only. It is an invitation to think about how do we imagine, you know, escaping the structures of oppression. And I think the way forward is to continue building along those horizontal kind of mobilizations that are transnational and transregional as well.
Well, moving from the horizontal to the vertical, Tareq, you spoke about Gaza, you spoke about Hamas, and Palestinians always speak about the need for Palestinian unity between Hamas and Fatah governments. And the Americans and the Israelis also speak about the need for some sort of a Palestinians speak in one voice. But whenever they do, they seem to undermine their unity as they did before, back in 2006. And they keep putting conditions, of course, on whatever unity government there is between the two. How do you see that issue of Palestinian unity on the vertical level happening?
Thank you, Marwan. Well, I actually think when I think about Palestinian unity, I'm not necessarily thinking about factional unity. I'm not thinking about reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah. I think both parties have been problematic in different ways, and both parties no longer necessarily represent where the Palestinians are at. So I think the biggest challenge that Palestinians have is to think about what kind of institution can hold the unity that's happening on the ground now and transform some of that unity into a form of political power to address the structures of domination that they're fighting against. So there will always be an interest by Israel and by the US to make sure that there is no unity. The divisions between Hamas and Fatah are, of course, primarily the responsibility of the leaders of those parties, but they're also one example of this unity. The fragmentation of Palestinians between 48 and the OPT is another. The Palestinians in the different refugee camps throughout the region is another. Those are all forms of fragmentation in this unity that are the outcome of Israeli settler colonialism. So when we only think about Hamas and Fatah, we're thinking about a very narrow view of what unity looks like that already buys into a partitionist model that already separates Palestinians and the OPT from the rest of the Palestinians. So I think we're at a stage now, and I think we have been for a few years, where the Palestinian mobilization that's happening on the ground is calling for a different form of unity, and one that maybe liberates the PLO from the strictures of the PA that have imprisoned it. And how we go back to that, whether it's in the PLO or in another body, is for Palestinians to decide. But there needs to be a form of institution building that builds on unity beyond the factional, unity of the people sort of geographically beyond the partition reality they're living in now.
Dana, can you detail this for us? What does that mean? Because on the basis of your own presentation about the popular mobilization and the response to the stalemate in the PA and its dependency on the United States and the Oslo process, how do you envision then this horizontal mobilization? And could we envision a future in Palestine without the PA?
So this is a tough question because the PA has become quite embedded, where sovereignty is elusive, but certain levels of capacity have been achieved, and people do look towards the Palestinian Authority's institutions, whether they're employed by them or whatever the relationship is, as a form of engagement. So can we envision a situation without the PA? Well, the kind of reimagining what the PA would be like. A lot of people are calling for the PA to kind of be more of a service provider, not a political decision-making body. And that is something to consider. That's kind of where a lot of the calls to reform the PLO and kind of bypass the PA are coming from. But I think that where opportunities exist, it really, there are these kind of structural obstacles, but I do also believe in people's agency, and I think Palestinians can seize their agency to realize some of what these obstacles entail, and how these obstacles impact their ability to coordinate with each other and truly bypass them, rather than falling kind of into the same trap. So it takes kind of like a proper diagnosis to be able to allow for activist groups to realize, okay, well, here are the structural obstacles that we face in the West Bank, and here's how we can move forward as kind of a collective in any kind of nationwide campaign. And I think to some degree that those conversations are starting to happen, at least when I'm having conversations with some of these activists. That's what they're telling me. They're trying to move around. So we have something like the new initiative جيل التجديد الديمقراطي. So like there is attempts to kind of create alternative bodies just to get even Palestinians talking to each other across these divides, and coordinating with each other across these divides. The structural obstacles are large, but I don't doubt Palestinian agency.
Well, speaking of Palestinian agency, the last several months, the Palestinians have proven once again to be inspirational, as we've heard earlier, and clearly inspirational in a way whereby people across the globe, were repeating and watching with awe what's happening in Jerusalem and Gaza and elsewhere, and hence the question, Yousef, is considering such inspiration did move people, notably in the United States, whether it is among the Palestinian diaspora. Even we've heard of people we never heard before speaking about Palestine, and then with millions upon millions of followers suddenly now speaking for Palestine, as well as other progressive forces, including Jewish liberal voices and progressives and so on and so forth, speaking for Palestine in the United States. How then do you see Palestinians inspiring others in the United States to speak out and perhaps eventually influence the decision-making in Washington?
Well, Marwan, I think this is, it's important, but it's also not new. Palestine has long been at the center of many revolutionary causes historically. Going back decades, many of the links that we see today between activist communities in Palestine and around the world are built upon layers and layers of historical links that go back throughout time. And I think that Palestine has always had a sort of unique and special resonance, in part because it has been this long-standing, unresolved liberation struggle that continues to touch people in the heart around the world. I think that I personally have been at awe at the strength of many of the young leaders on the ground in Palestine to not only to continue to speak up, but to find new and dynamic and creative ways to reach out to the world and to tell their stories and evade the sort of traditional filters that would have silenced their voices or altered their narratives. And I think that where there is hope for Palestine and the Palestinians, much of it lies in these very people. Yeah.
So you actually think there is a role for the Palestinian diaspora and other progressive forces now in the United States to influence decision making in Washington on the Palestinian question?
Well, we talk about the Palestinian diaspora, and I think it's in a short answer, yes. But I think what I would encourage us to think about is that I don't necessarily see the Palestinian diaspora as sort of a diaspora in the traditional sense. Yes, we are a people that is spread all over the globe, but this condition is not necessarily voluntary for many of us, and it is the product of being denied access to our homeland. And so, yes, geographically, we are in different places, but we are part of a single nation, and we are part of a single body politic. And I think that it's important for us to keep that in mind. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we have is, and that we need to address is the absence of coordination mechanisms and leadership that actually allows the entirety of a nation to work together for a unified goal. It's not a lack of will or creativity or power or dedication, and much of it is a product of the situation that we've been in because of settler colonialism over the years.
Well, on that note, Yousef, Dana, Tareq, and Sherene, thank you so much. And thank you, the rest of you, our audience, as it were, for joining us and for sharing your insights and questions.